Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook Live and the only place where Shaka answers your question. I'm Peter Clotty. Shaka Sally is away, so join me today is Blessing Zulu. Blessing, how are you?
I'm doing great, sir. Thank you so much.
Good. As an expert on Zimbabwe from the Zimbabwe service, what is your take on the upcoming election next week? It appears that Zimbabweans are very excited, and this is the first time that Zimbabweans will go to the polls since independence, that they will be voting for a presidential candidate not named President
Robert
Mugabe.
Indeed. President Robert Mugabe was ousted last year in what many are calling a soft coup. And it's also the first time since 1999 that Zimbabwe is going to this election without Morgan Tsvangirai on the ballot, the main opposition leader who succumbed to colon cancer earlier this year. But of course, people are very excited about the election on Monday, which has been declared a national holiday.
Talking about the voter campaigns, a lot of polls have been conducted. People are expressing concern about voter intimidation and harassment in the run-up to the election. People thought that it was a past thing, but it appears to be rearing its head again. What is happening there?
Initially, the president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, had promised that this was going to be a free, fair and credible election, and he said no to violence. As you remember, in 2008, there was supposed to be a runoff, but it ended up not happening because of the violence. More than 200 opposition supporters were allegedly killed by members of the ruling ZANU-PF party. And the election was cancelled, and the result was that the United States of America, the European Union, and other countries tightened sanctions on Zimbabwe. So this is why this election was important to say Zimbabwe has moved from the past. But I must say, from reports that we are hearing, the violence compared to previous years is better, but intimidation is still going on. Allegations are that chiefs, mostly who are sympathetic to ZANU-PF, are the ones who are intimidating people. And one of the Chiefs Council president was taken to the High Court by the opposition after he had urged people to vote for ZANU-PF. So intimidation, yes, is still happening, but at a limited scale.
Will former President Robert Gabriel Mugabe be a factor in these elections?
Mugabe definitely is a factor. Interestingly, there was a report, a survey rather, by Afrobarometer, working with the mass public opinion in Zimbabwe, which actually, surprisingly, came out with the result that 37% of Zimbabweans actually trust Robert Mugabe. You know, so
interesting.
Indeed, it is very interesting. So there have been attempts by both the main opposition party, which is the MDC Alliance, and ZANU-PF to court President Robert Mugabe. But he is, some say, he's likely to, if he were to vote for the MDC Alliance, because he's very bitter by the way he was ousted by his comrades in ZANU-PF.
Now, recent polls talking about the Afrobarometer, the polls show that the presidential election is going to be a tight race. Do you foresee that happening with less than 2 weeks to the polls?
Indeed. I think if you look at the crowds that have been attending rallies for the main contenders, that is President Emmerson Mnangagwa and MDC Alliance leader Nelson Camisas, they've been pulling the crowd. So I won't be surprised that there is likely to be a runoff, which, if it happens, it has to be on September 8th, because the Constitution of Zimbabwe says that for you to be declared an outright winner, you must have 50% plus 1 vote. So if you don't reach that threshold, there's going to be an election runoff. Of course, there are 23 candidates contesting, which might be a disadvantage for the opposition, because there are just too many presidential candidates, and it might actually favor ZANU-PF.
Some Zimbabweans say that the are concerned that there is not a single particular candidate representing the opposition parties to significantly pose a threat to the ZANU-PF dominance. Do you foresee that happening? And if I may ask you this question, why haven't they seen this? Because in other African countries, you have all these opposition parties, in spite of the ideological differences, teaming up just to get rid of the incumbent because their aim is similar. They want to get the ruling party out. So why don't you form an alliance, get rid of them, and then try to resolve the issues once you come into power?
That's a very interesting question, Peter, because you see, Zimbabwe is a population of about 13.6 million, and the parties, we now have about 123 political parties. This year, 23 presidential candidates. But the joke in the country is that if you put 5 Zimbabweans, politicians, in one room, only 5, for 2 hours to form a coalition, what will result is that you end up having 7 political parties and 3 non-governmental organizations. So despite the fact that their cause seems to be the same, they somehow seem not to agree. Because if you look at the MDC itself, when Tsvangirai died and when Nelson Chamisa took over, there was a split because Tsvangirai had 3 deputies, that is Nelson Chamisa, Thokozani Kupi, and Elias Mudzuri. So they were supposed to go to elect a new leader at a congress, but some in the party felt that Chamisa was more popular, so they opted for him. So Thokozani Kupe ended up forming her own political party, which is contesting these elections. And some also claim that the ruling party is known to create opposition parties to say, well, there's democracy in Zimbabwe, simply because there are these pseudo-political parties, if we can call them that.
But wouldn't this be a motivating factor for them to come really as a united front rather than having their, their rank divided? Because this has been used over and over again, a tactics that they said ZANU-PF often employs. So why not blunt the effect of that threat?
Very surprising, because interestingly, in 2008, when there was this runoff, Tsvangirai could have won if the opposition was united, because Simba Makoni of Mavambo Kusile Don had about 8% of the vote. So if he had worked with Tsvangirai, the opposition could have won. But unfortunately, they say if you don't learn from history, you risk repeating it with all its imperfections. So this is basically what we are seeing in Zimbabwe. They seem not to agree.
Realistically, what are the chances of Nelson Chamisa? He's been vociferous, he's been campaigning all over the place, lashing out. There were even reports of him having an agreement with President Robert Mugabe, that President Mugabe will endorse him ahead of the election. What are his realistic chances? Because I understand that the crocodile, the president in Emmerson Mnangagwa, seemed not to command the entire machinery of ZANU-PF, because there are some factions within the ZANU-PF that still want Mugabe to be president, and that they are so displeased that they might not even vote for him at all.
The problem for Chamisa might be voter apathy, because elections in Zimbabwe previously have been very violent. So I wouldn't call them elections. Some analysts will call that electoralism. It's just a ritual that you are going for elections, but it's not an election at all. You are just endorsing a candidate, like what was allegedly happening with President Robert Mugabe. So if people don't turn out, that might be the major problem for the opposition. And also some people are very skeptical about the army, because the army begged Mnangagwa after the ouster of President Robert Mugabe. So many are saying that even if Chamisa wins this election, is there going to be a smooth handover of power? So I think that is why we are seeing that the African Union, SADC, and many, the European Union, many organizations are in Zimbabwe right now to make sure that there is no violence. So these are some of the fears working against the opposition, because previously the army generals have said they won't salute anyone without liberation war credentials. Well, Camisas is 40. He could not have gone to war, you know, because he was about 2 years old, you know, and when Zimbabwe got its independence, he was 2 years old. So he could not have gone to war. So these are the problems. There are also war veterans who have also been threatening that, you know, they won't salute anyone who was not part of the liberation war. But things are changing. You know, 67% of Zimbabweans are below the age of 35, you know, and they don't have this history at all.
Do you think the presence of the international community, as well as the African Union, the SADC poll observer missions, could pressure the Electoral Commission to ensure that the elections are free, fair, transparent, and credible?
I think if we go by what is happening, like today, for example, there was a major reversal because the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission was saying that, you know, when you are voting, they were saying they were concerned that you were going to go into the booth with your camera and then you take a picture of whatever, the ballot and stuff like that. So they said, no, we don't want that to happen. So what we are going to do is to ensure that when you are voting, the election observers will be right behind you seeing what you are doing. And everyone was like, no, wait a minute, you know, there's no secrets at all. So the opposition had been demonstrating previously. So we understand because of pressure from the AU and SADC, the Southern African Development Community, they've reversed that now to say, no, you can vote in secret. So you can say at least it's working. And also it's important to note that unlike in previous years, this year they came earlier. You know, they would come after, you know, with 2 weeks to go, and then they would just come in and rubber stamp and say everything was okay. And then violence will break out like what we saw in Kenya. So at least it's commendable that in Zimbabwe they came earlier, the African Union, SADC, the EU, and everyone. And some are saying this is why violence is limited.
Do you think the prospective Zimbabwean voters have confidence in the Electoral Commission to organize a credible election this time?
I think opinion is divided. Talking to the ruling ZANU-PF party, they are saying they are very happy with the way the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is handling matters. But talking to the opposition and some independent groups like non-governmental organizations, they are saying, you know, ZEC is not transparent at all. The way even they designed the ballot paper, they are alleging that it's meant to benefit President Emmerson Mnangagwa. ZEC has also refused to show the political parties, you know, even the design and where they are keeping the ballots. So all that is being disputed. And ZEC is also supposed to monitor, you know, the media in the run-up to the election, the public media at least, to ensure, you know, there is fairness. That has not been done. So there is a long laundry list of what the opposition is saying must be done, which is not happening. And it's clear that Zimbabwe is headed for another disputed election.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show only here on Facebook. I'm Peter Clotte, joined by Blessing Zulu. So let me ask you, are the opposition political parties satisfied with engaging the Electoral Commission, raising concerns for them to be addressed in time for the election, so that the disputing the outcome of the election could be minimal?
Unfortunately, it has not been happening. It has been dragging for a long time. And interestingly, the opposition wanted to protest on Friday. The election is on Monday to ensure that there are some changes. But we understand that the police have said, no, they cannot protest because they have a rally on Saturday. And, you know, they are talking about manpower, the excuses that the police was giving. But I think it's rather too late. I think there are other issues like what former UN Secretary General Annan said, that there were some things that could have been addressed. There are some things that he said are a bit unreasonable on the part of the opposition. But now it's getting late, unfortunately.
So were you impressed with the voter education, the civic education in the run-up to the election to ensure that these voters know what they are supposed to do. They lay down regulations by the Electoral Commission, followed to the letter and all that. Were you impressed by what they did?
From what I'm hearing, I think many people are disgruntled. They are saying that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, or ZEC, did not do a good job because the constitution was changed to say that only ZEC can do that. You know, previously, non-governmental organizations like the Zimbabwe Election Support Network were helping the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. But the constitution now says, you know, if you want to conduct voter education and they are not the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, you have to take like all your material and people who are funding you to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and then it can say you can go ahead or not. So ZEC has no capacity to conduct elections because Zimbabwe is cash-strapped at the moment, and most of the funding for these elections is coming from the developed nations via the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP. So not much was done in terms of voter education.
I understand the Electoral Commission says, you know, printing of the ballot papers will be done in Zimbabwe, and that they've identified some printing houses to do that. Now, did they engage the political parties to ensure transparency in the process of the printing, so there wouldn't be accusations that they were hoarding of some ballot papers and they were pre-thumb printed in order to support one candidate or the other?
That was not done, unfortunately. The company that printed, according to the Zimbabwe Election Commission, is a government-owned printing press, and it's called Fidelity Printers in Zimbabwe. But the opposition was not allowed to go there, which is very interesting, because if you look at Zimbabwe's neighbors to the north, Zambia, the ballots were printed in Dubai in 2016, and everyone went there. You know, all the players went there, they observed everything, they came back with the ballots, they, you know, ensured that they were stored properly. That's not what is happening in Zimbabwe.
Interestingly, in Zambia, they said although they inspected the process of the printing, they were not allowed to accompany the printed ballot boxes on the same plane back to Zambia, despite the fact that they were on the ground when the ballot papers came. So they said, well, there were some shenanigans going on. So they still disputed the election. So I wonder how this is going to go.
Yeah, it's another dispute. But at least in Zambia, they were seeing how, you know, although they could not do some things, but at least it was better, unlike what is happening in Zimbabwe, you know, where it's a total blackout.
Officials of the Electoral Commission, as I spoke, the chairperson was telling me that they were going to involve the political party representatives, so they will be there during the printing process. So what happened?
This is what happened now. They agreed, right? They said that is what we are going to do. So when the political parties went there, they were standing like 20 meters away from where the the ballots were allegedly being printed. And they said, you see, they are printed right there where those printers are. And the party said, no, we need to see. They said, no, you can't.
No close
inspection. It's a security zone. It's a security zone. So you are not allowed to enter. So, you know, you can't call that observing. You know, the way it does not... It does not sound to me like it was observing how things were done. You know, they were not allowed. They were not even close.
Interesting. Let me ask you about your views regarding the elders visiting Zimbabwe. Kofi Annan and his people went there. Interestingly, they refused to, or said they didn't have time to meet Robert Gabriel Mugabe, the former president, because they were prevented from, you know, visiting the country in the previous elections when President Mugabe was still the head of state of the country. Interesting dynamics, but what is your take on that?
Indeed, it is very interesting because, like you correctly pointed out, the elders, I think, with the late Nelson Mandela then, they were not allowed, you know, to observe the elections. It's not only them, even the EU was kicked out in 2002 by President Robert Mugabe. You know, anyone that did not agree with him was not allowed to come in. But now, interestingly, it seems now he is isolated. You know, not many are willing to go and talk to him. I talked to his former Vice President, Joyce Mujuru, who is also a presidential candidate at one time, Mugabe called her and she went to his residence, and she was saying that he was complaining that now he feels isolated, is deserted by all his friends. So I think Annan is joining that long list of people who are snubbing former President Robert Mugabe.
But I understand anybody who goes there, like the chairperson of the African Union going there, he complained that he was illegally booted out of power and that they should put pressure on the new administration to return him to power and all that. How feasible is this? Some people are saying probably he's going senile. That is why he's complaining all over the place. But what are the people of Zimbabwe saying?
I think, you know, it's too late for him to make a comeback. It's a bit late, but I thought... I think he suspects that he still has some sympathizers, even in the Central Intelligence Organization, the equivalent of the CIA here. Those were supporting him, but they are being systematically dismantled by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. He had also sympathizers in the police force, and there are many changes that are happening. So, you know, it will be difficult because all his sympathizers are being weeded out and replaced by people more sympathetic to Emmerson Mnangagwa. And remember also when the coup was taking place, they first disarmed all the police officers in the country, you know, and they took all the guns. So it's difficult for Mr. Mugabe. I think he should just enjoy his retirement.
Now, talking about the election, the latest Afrobarometer poll expressed concern by a lot of respondents, Zimbabweans, saying that they fear that the election results could be manipulated or the process itself could be manipulated. How true is this, and do they expect that this election would improve their lives from what they have known under President Mugabe?
I think rightly so, Zimbabweans are concerned that if there's another disputed election, the country will be isolated. And we have noted that, you know, many observers are concerned by some of the things that are happening, although they are saying there is an improvement. But is it good enough to make sure that this will be called a credible election? We'll see after Monday, but it looks like there will be a protest. And, you know, investors don't want to come in such an environment. So it's going to be very difficult for Zimbabwe if this election is deemed not to be credible at all.
But do these opposition parties have the legal recourse to challenge the outcome of the election if they are able to garner evidence that indeed perhaps ZANU-PF might have manipulated the elections, or, you know, there are voter irregularities here and there? Do they have that legal path, and how independent is the legal process to ensure fairness or equity in addressing some of their concerns if indeed they dispute the outcome of the election?
I think that's another major problem, not only in Zimbabwe, but in Africa, that there are no institutions to ensure that, you know, there are checks and balances. Interestingly, Peter, the opposition under the late Shangirai challenged the outcome of the 2000 election. And this is 2018. No rulings in some cases. 18 years later. You know, so this is why people are skeptical. This is why you see the opposition going into the streets, because they are not confident that if they go to the courts, they feel that the courts are compromised. Of course, there are some good judges. You can't paint them all with the same brush and say they are doing a terrible job. There are some who are very professional, but many Zimbabweans feel that going to the courts, it's a waste of time, because most of those judges are actually appointed by the president, because there was a change in the 2013 election, which many felt was progressive, in that judges who go to the Judicial Service Commission, there were interviews, and then Parliament will also help in selecting a judge. But, you know, who said no? is President Emmerson Mnangagwa, when he was then Justice Minister, he said, no, the president must appoint all the judges, without scrutiny from the Judiciary Service Commission or from Parliament. So if you have that situation, it creates very serious problems. So no hope there.
So let's go to those Facebook followers who came up with questions. Omojuguju from Moses from Uganda, he said, what is your take on Jean-Pierre Bemba running for president in Congo? And then Ngo Akol Thiep, how do we stop sectarian politics in Africa? And then Annabelle Roberts said, why is it that after electing African leaders, they reluctantly refuse to do exactly what they told us in their manifesto? And then Mani Kachili from Tanzania said, the political terminologies like democratic and republic have meanings and true purposes. Do you think some African countries deserve these titles, names, or they just use like surface titles or names? And then Musimiru Leonard Muta from Uganda said, what is causing brutality in African nations? So what is your take on some of these questions?
I think they are the same. You look at Zimbabwe, the situation is not very different from what is happening, for example, in the DRC. You have Kabila. It's time for him to step down. This is what you saw again with former President Robert Mugabe. It had to take the military to intervene. And, most of those questions, many are saying that are questioning the very essence of democracy in Africa. If you look at what happens in America, of course, there are disputes here and there, but democracy is working. You have the courts and stuff like that. But unfortunately, in Africa, it's what I called earlier on electoralism. It's just a ritual. So what happens is if elections are disputed, you end up people not believing in elections. So if people don't believe in elections, what do? They resort to violence. That's what we are seeing in the DRC. Or someone talked about Bemba. That's also interesting after his trial and all. But it might actually mean more violence as Kabila refuses to step down. So I think Africa must have institutions that ensure there's democracy, independent media, courts must be independent, and it also goes to the African Union and these regional groups like ECOWAS, like SADC. They must, most of the time, they just go there and say they seem to support the incumbent in any election.
It's a brotherhood.
Yes, but they have like SADC, and they have these guidelines which are not being followed, and they don't condemn. You call them brotherhood. I think that's the correct term. So they don't go there and make sure that democracy is taking place. If there's no democracy, the economies tend not to perform very well, and Africa, as a result, is exploited because it's not speaking with one voice. There's a war here. There's, all those cause serious problems. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in most African countries to ensure, democracy is taking place. But of course, there are good examples. Ghana, there are problems there, but you can say democracy is working. You go to South Africa, for example, what happened to President Zuma, the corruption and all. Those are very good cases that I think can be emulated when it comes to elections and democracy.
All right, many thanks to Blessing Zulu. Thank you very much for joining us for Shaka Extra Time, a show where we answer your questions only on Facebook. I'm Peter Clottey. Join us again next week. Good night.
a more